Hey everyone, this is our lesson for today. I know it's titled The Foreign Policies of Teddy Roosevelt, but we're also going to do the end of the Spanish-American War, and then we're going to get into Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policies. So I have 30 minutes, so I have to get out my phone and get my timer going so I know that I don't go over time. So here we go. Starting now is going to be 28 minutes and 55 seconds before we stop. All right, so where I decided to leave off yesterday was after the military. So we were talking about the fact that the Spanish-American War is called the Splendid Little War. And that's what we're going to get into a little bit today, and then we'll talk about Teddy Roosevelt as president. So what is the little side of the Spanish-American War? It's a short war. It is only 4 months long. We're going to talk about the Philippine insurrection on Wednesday, and that lasted 3 years. So it's a very short war, and it had very little battle deaths. Most of the people that die in the Spanish-American War, they died of some kind of tropical disease. In terms of actually dying in battle, the number of battle deaths was under 400. So it's a small war, 4 months, very few deaths, and the result is dramatic. The United States gains an empire. And for the time, when it's John Hay, who's a Republican, when they're talking about a splendid little war, it's because they wanted Spain's empire and they're going to get it. Now the ironic thing is, the country they most wanted, the Republicans, was Cuba. But Cuba is going to come out of the Spanish-American War technically independent, but not in reality. So Cuba never becomes part of the United States. It never becomes an actual American colony. And that's because, and this is what I mentioned to you guys in the past, the anti-imperialists are going to maneuver things to their advantage, and then the Republicans, the imperialists, are going to maneuver things back. So let's talk about that. When the war is declared on Spain, the Democrats accuse the Republicans, particularly the ones led by Teddy Roosevelt and the Jingos, of simply trying to grab control of Cuba, and that's the only reason they want this war. It's not for Cuban independence, it's not for the Cuban people, it's not to end the concentration camps. So the Republicans, of course, at this point are saying that's not true, and they are trapped by the Democrats by promising, in order to get the declaration of war, that should Cuba become independent, they will not take Cuba as a colony. And that is known as the Teller Amendment. That is attached to an army requisition bill. In other words, a bill meant to get money for the army to fight the war in Cuba. They attached the Teller Amendment, which declares that no matter what happens in the Spanish-American War, if Cuba is freed from Spanish rule, they will get their independence, and the United States will not grab Cuba as a colony. Okay, so the Republicans then turn around, and near the end of the war, they issue the Platt Amendment. Now remember, this is at a time where white man's burden is a serious thing. And there are people, even Democrats in America, who believe that the United States has a duty to help these countries. All right. So what the Republicans say to the Democrats is, we don't want to just give Cuba its independence and leave it to its own devices. Some big powerful country other than us will come in and grab Cuba, or Cuba will fall into disarray. They've been so mistreated by the Spanish for 400 years. We need to go in, and we need to make sure that Cuba remains independent. And so they list the conditions that Cuba must put in its constitution that will declare when Cuba can be fully independent. And that's what the Platt Amendment says. It lists the conditions that Cuba must follow before it could get independence. Now that you've read it, there are a number of them. Cuba can't allow foreign powers to have any kind of fortresses in Cuba. In other words, they can't station troops in Cuba. Cuba can't get in debt to foreign nations. The United States is allowed to intervene in Cuba as it sees fit to promote Cuban independence. And in the meantime, the United States will appoint a military governor who will then oversee Cuba, and eventually that becomes Leonard Wood. Now, the good part of this is the United States does actually do a lot of good things in Cuba. They start building hospitals, they start building power plants, telegraph lines, they start figuring out why so many public work projects in Cuba fail, and that's because people working on them get malaria or yellow fever. And a doctor named Walter Reed discovers that those diseases are carried by mosquitoes. Things that we take for granted today, that mosquitoes spread disease, that was not known at the time. Reed is the guy who discovered that, with his assistant, Dr. William Gorgas, who we'll talk about later when we talk about the Panama Canal. So America goes into Cuba and actually does improve the situation for the Cuban people, and eventually Cuba will get independence. Now, the Platt Amendment will eventually be renounced by Herbert Hoover when he announces the Good Neighbor policy, where he attempts to repair our relationship with Latin American countries. The colonies we do get are the leftover Spanish colonies. So first we get Puerto Rico. Now, Puerto Rico is, I'm going to show you on the map, Puerto Rico is considered the gateway to the Caribbean. And if you remember when we were talking about Mahan, and I had told you that we wanted to dominate the Caribbean for one reason, or you actually told me, was because it controls access to the Panama Canal. If you just look at where Puerto Rico is, you can't get into the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico without going past Puerto Rico. So it's very strategically located to control access to the Panama Canal. So we're going to get Puerto Rico, and they are going to get a very unique status. They're the only country that has this status with the United States. We call it Commonwealth status. That's just the term we're using. And essentially, Puerto Rico can conduct its own domestic affairs. It can run itself domestically, but it's still under the protection of the United States when it comes to foreign policy. So the people of Puerto Rico are sort of halfway between full citizenship in the United States. So that's a very unique relationship that we have with Puerto Rico. Every once in a while, there'll be a discussion over whether Puerto Rico should become the 51st state, or whether it should be given its full independence, or maintain its Commonwealth status. And there are a lot of opinion polls out there that are very unreliable, because they always say, would you rather be independent, or would you rather be a state? And the Puerto Rican people generally say we'd rather be part of the United States than fully independent. But whenever the poll says, would you rather maintain your Commonwealth status or be a state, they almost universally choose to be a Commonwealth. So it seems the majority of Puerto Rican people like this very unique status, where they get to control their own domestic policy, but they still enjoy the protection of the United States. We also get Guam, which is part of the Northern Marianas Islands chain. I don't even think I could find Guam. We use Guam here to describe being in the middle of nowhere. So I'm going to have to search for Guam, because it's a very small, evidently beautiful tropical island in South Pacific. And it's part of that Northern Marianas Island chain. And Guam is another of those coaling stations like Samoa that allows us to trade in Southeast Asia. Okay. Hawaii, as I told you, was grabbed as part of the imperialism that we're practicing at this point. It was not controlled by Spain. It's an independent country, but McKinley then finishes up what was begun by Sanford Dole and Benjamin Harrison, and Hawaii becomes part of the United States. And of course, there's what happens in the Philippines. Okay, on Wednesday, you're supposed to be reading the Filipino insurrection. And I'm going to talk more about this on Wednesday, the Philippine insurrection and the resulting debate. So on Wednesday, there'll be a quiz on the Philippine insurrection. It's a very good reading, because there are a lot of lessons and correlations between what happened in the Philippines and what happened in Vietnam. So the leader of the Philippine insurrection, Emilio Aguinaldo, leads a 3-year resistance to American rule, where that is far longer than the Spanish-American War took, and far more Americans died trying to, as we put it, pacify the Philippines. The result of that is there's a huge debate in the United States, which again, I'm going to talk about this more on Wednesday. So we're just going to skip this slide for now, and I'm going to go back and talk about this with you on Wednesday after you've done the reading. There's this huge debate in the United States over whether we should be conquering the Philippines. because it's very clear from the resistance we meet that the people of the Philippines want their independence. So when America conquers the Philippines and makes them a colony, it's very much and clear that it's against the will of the Filipino people. So we're kind of straying into more social Darwinism a little bit. It's still that idea of white man's burden. All right, so now we're going to talk about Teddy Roosevelt and his foreign policy. Roosevelt is a unique president. We're going to talk about his domestic policy and how he became president when we get to the progressive era. Teddy Roosevelt becomes president because William McKinley is assassinated. His foreign policy is his own. Nobody really cares about Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy because it pretty much is in line with the majority of Americans, which is America should become a world power. His domestic policies are more complex, and we'll talk about those. Teddy Roosevelt, in many ways, is the first modern American president. And one of the things he did as president is he was his own Secretary of State. And by that I mean every president prior to Roosevelt, even one as powerful and strong as a Lincoln or a Washington, they let their secretaries of state conduct their foreign policy. They were fairly hands-off. The idea was that the Secretary of State would get a general idea from the president of what he wanted. They would then make the policy. Teddy Roosevelt is going to be his own Secretary of State. He's going to drive Elihu Root and John Hay crazy because he's constantly doing his own thing. And one of his most famous phrases that he believed guided his foreign policy was what we call an apocryphal term. Teddy Roosevelt, when asked about his foreign policy, said, "I believe in the West African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick." And what he means by that is, you don't need to threaten, you don't need to scream, you don't need to carry on, you need to be powerful. And if a nation is powerful, other nations will respect it. You just need to show them that you're powerful. You don't need to be aggressive. You don't need to be violent. You don't need to fight a war. You just need to make yourself powerful. Now, today that concept is known as deterrence, and we'll talk more about that when we get to Eisenhower. So that's Roosevelt's idea. The problem with the phrase is, no one has ever been able to find any West African culture that ever had a saying that said, speak softly and carry a big stick. So we're pretty sure that Teddy Roosevelt just made it up, knowing that no one in America outside of him had ever even been to Africa. Okay, so he's going to conduct his own foreign policy, and the first thing he's going to do, which is the perfect example of his policy of speak softly and carry a big stick, is he builds the most modern fleet in the world, the Great White Fleet. It's a series of battleships and destroyers, and he sends this fleet on a tour of the world. And they go from nation to nation, docking in their harbors, peacefully, friendly nations, and all the people in those nations come down to see the most modern technology, the most modern ships. It'd be kind of like going to an air show or a car show today, or any kind of a tech show where you get to see the latest technology. Back then, the most advanced technology would be naval vessels. So everybody around the world is coming out to see this fleet. In particular, the Japanese are incredibly impressed with the Great White Fleet because they are trying to become a naval power in their own right. Now, when the Great White Fleet lands and is in your country peacefully, the message is pretty clear. It's good to be friends with the United States. You don't want these ships coming back angry, firing their guns. And the message was very much received by the rest of the world. Okay, so with the building of the Great White Fleet, Roosevelt has now accomplished one of Mahan's goals, which is to become one of the most powerful nations in the world. We're now past Germany. We are the second most powerful nation in the world when it comes to a navy. All right, so since we're talking about Japan, we're going to talk about probably Roosevelt's greatest success was his action in the Russo-Japanese War. All right, Roosevelt has a unique position. We are allies with both Russia and Japan when they enter into a war. Now, why did they fight a war? Japan and Russia are competing over control of Manchuria, which is the northern part of China, as well as Korea and what are known as the Sakhalin Islands. And the Japanese, realizing that they weren't getting anywhere with Russia, that Russia didn't really respect them, they decide to settle this war militarily, and in a sneak attack, sound familiar, catch the Russians completely off guard, and are winning a series of victories against what is considered one of the great European powers. Now, why is this important? Russia believes, and this is how Russia fights every war, that the longer this war goes on, the better their chances for winning it. Japan believes that they're going to win the war. So neither side is particularly eager to find a peaceful solution to this war. Why does Teddy Roosevelt involve himself? There's a few reasons. One, war is not good for anyone. War tends to create instability. War tends to spread, and we've got interests in Asia. It's not good for the United States to have a war going on that they could somehow get embroiled in. Same thing's going to happen in World War II. We're going to, because of our interests in Asia, get drawn into World War II. Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a result of America having an interest in Asia. So Roosevelt is able to get the Russians and the Japanese to settle their dispute peacefully, and he negotiates that himself. It's called the Portsmouth Treaty because it takes place in America with Roosevelt mediating both sides. Now, in particular, we got to get the Japanese to accept a peaceful settlement where they don't get everything they want. And the way he's able to do this is he kind of negotiates a side deal with the Japanese known as the Root-Takahira Agreement. Now, you'll notice that he gets the water end in 1905. We don't issue the Root-Takahira Agreement until 1908 because he didn't want it to be seen as a deal that was made under the table, but it was. Elihu Root is the American Secretary of State. Takahira is the Japanese Foreign Minister. And they come out with an agreement that says Japan and the United States recognize each other's holdings in the Pacific and acknowledge each other's interests in the Pacific. In other words, Japan now has control of Korea, parts of Manchuria, the Sakhalin Islands. America says, we acknowledge those are your colonies. The United States has Guam, the Philippines, Samoa, Hawaii. The Japanese are acknowledging that. They're acknowledging the reality. They're not giving each other anything except public recognition of each other. Why is that important? It's important to the Japanese. The way we have always viewed Europe is we want Europe to recognize us as equals. The Japanese feel the same way about America. And that has to do with the Treaty of Kanagawa. Now this guy, Matthew Perry, is sent to Japan to open Japan to trade with the United States. Japan, unlike China, when they first come in contact with Europe, recognize the threat Europe is and close themselves off as much as possible to European trade or any contact with the West, and they try to maintain their feudal society. When Perry comes in, he basically comes in with an American fleet. He sails around on Kido Harbor, which is Tokyo Harbor, blowing up trees with American guns, and then he says to the Japanese, what do you think? And they're like, well, that's very impressive. Wouldn't you love to be friends with the United States? And they recognize what's going on. It's a veiled threat. Either open yourselves up or we will come in and take over. So Japan decides that they got to change, and they decide to completely modernize their country. So in the 1850s, Japan decides to abandon feudalism and become a modern, industrialized society. And in 40 years, they're able to completely revamp their economy, their society, and create a modern industrialized society. It's considered a miracle how quickly the Japanese modernized. Now they do that in very intelligent ways. They invite the British, the Germans, the Americans to come in and teach them modern engineering and modern techniques. They send their best and their brightest out into the world to learn these techniques. But as you might imagine, that was pretty humiliating to the Japanese, that a foreign nation could come in and so completely dominate and intimidate them. So when the United States is willing to publicly recognize the Japanese as an equal, that's a big deal for the Japanese. Excuse me. Okay. The other big interest we have in China, in Asia, is trading with China. And that's something you're going to read for tomorrow, known as the open door policy. So that's a reading I've assigned for tomorrow's class. The open door policy and the Boxer Rebellion go hand in hand. So again, that's something I'm going to discuss with you on Wednesday. I'm not going to go into detail with it right now. Just know this. In the 1840s, Caleb Cushing, a diplomat, is sent to China, and he negotiates something that's still around today. It's called Most Favored Nation status with China, or MFN status. We still have that with China. Everybody has it with China. Most Favored Nation status simply means you don't get treated any differently than any other nation in China. So if one nation gets a benefit with China, every other nation who has Most Favored Nation has to get that benefit. It really is just a way of trying to have equal trading rights in China. By the 1870s, no one is really upholding that. There are all these spheres of influence in China. And each nation of Europe has basically carved out a piece of China where they have a monopoly on trade, and China is in a desperate situation as a result. The Boxer Rebellion was an attempt to get rid of that. And like I said, I want you to read those two articles tomorrow first, and then we'll talk about this on Wednesday in more detail. Okay, so our policy towards China has always been to trade, and the open door policy was an attempt for America to achieve that. And I'll talk about the story behind the story then. Okay, Europe. In Europe, war is looming between France and Germany. Germany is making a nuisance of itself, trying to grab control of French colonies in Africa, principally in Morocco. And there's a little bit of tension between the French and their colony in northern Africa, and the Germans are exacerbating it. And it looks like both sides are going to go to war. And Roosevelt, again, intercedes, just like he did in the Russo-Japanese War. He gets both sides to sit down and negotiate it into the war. Now, what no one realized at the time was that France and Germany are not ready for war, and neither one wants to fight the war yet. So they were amenable to Roosevelt doing this. Each actually secretly asked Roosevelt to intervene. So a lot of people point to the Algeciras Conference, that's a city in Spain, where he negotiated this end of hostilities. A lot of people point to this and say, hey, when World War I started, if someone like Roosevelt had stepped in and negotiated what was going on in Serbia, Russia and Austria-Hungary would have never gone to war, and World War I could be avoided. There's an entire school of history that believes World War I was avoidable. Roosevelt himself was saying that at the time, he wasn't president, Wilson was, that the president of the United States should be intervening to prevent this war. And they would point to the Algeciras Conference as saying, look, here comes Roosevelt at the right moment, and he's able to avoid this war. Others point to it saying, all he did was stave off the inevitable. That's one of those eternal arguments in history. I happen to think World War I was inevitable. Other teachers here believe that something like this, with an enlightened person intervening at the right moment, could have avoided the war. Okay, for all of these efforts, the Algeciras Conference, the Russo-Japanese War, Roosevelt becomes the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize and the first president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Barack Obama has won it, Woodrow Wilson won it, Jimmy Carter won it after he was president, so there have been other American presidents that have won it, and Martin Luther King Jr. won the Nobel Peace Prize. So there are Americans that have won it, but he's the first. All right, Roosevelt thought his greatest achievement was the building of the Panama Canal. Okay, again, we're back to Mahan's theory, right? We want a canal through Central America to get our Navy back and forth quickly, to cut down on the time for trade. Now, Roosevelt believes that America should project its power into the world. That's what he's all about. His successors, Taft and Wilson, also believe America should be out in the world, but for moral and economic reasons. All three are going to invade Latin America for one reason or another. So it's ironic that they all have very different philosophies about why America should be out in the world, but they all end up doing the same thing, which is be imperialistic and expand into Latin America. Okay, so we want a canal in Panama. France had tried to build the Panama Canal and failed. Everybody figured it was impossible if France couldn't do it, because France is the country that built the Suez Canal. The difference is the Suez Canal is in a desert. It's simply an engineering problem that had to be solved. The Panama Canal also had the added problem of mosquito-borne illnesses. So every time the French tried to get anything going, all their workers would get sick. They couldn't understand why. Well, we learned in Cuba, it's mosquito-borne. So William Gorgas comes from Cuba and goes to Panama and teaches them how to stave off mosquito-based diseases. Tragically, Walter Reed actually died in Cuba from these diseases. Okay, so Gorgas is the leading expert on mosquito-borne diseases. So what do? You drain stagnant water, you don't go out at dawn and dusk, you wear mosquito netting, you pour kerosene in muddled pools to kill mosquito larvae. Do all the things we do today to try to combat mosquitoes. They didn't have bug spray at that point, but those are the things you tried to do. Smoke, you'd burn smoke to try to keep mosquitoes off of you. And once we're able to cut down dramatically on the number of workers getting malaria and yellow fever, we're able to successfully work in Panama. All right, now, the Panama Canal is considered one of the engineering marvels of the early 20th century. It's an amazing accomplishment. They had to lift, it's still to this day, they have to lift ships using water over a mountain range to get them across Panama. The problem was, we bought the rights to build the Panama Canal from France, who bought them from Colombia. Colombia controlled Panama. Panama was a colony of Colombia. They border each other. The Colombians say to America, you can't buy them from France, you have to buy them from us, and they want $20 million for them. Roosevelt offers $5 million, they say no, so he gets mad, and he stages essentially a revolution in Panama. He finds some people in Panama who wanted Panamanian independence. He says to them, declare, basically has his ambassador, tell them to declare their independence. They declare their independence from Colombia. Colombia then sends troops and their navy to Panama, but when they get there, the American Army and Navy is already there. They turn around and go home because they know they can't fight the American Navy or Army, and we recognize Panama, and we cut a deal with Panama to build the canal through Panama. All right. This is one of those things about Roosevelt that he really didn't respect the constitutional authority of the Congress to approve things like this. So he does all of this on his own. He doesn't ask for congressional approval. And his phrase was, I needed the canal zone and I took it, and the canal goes on. And while the debate goes on in Congress, the canal does also. So he basically says, I'm building the Panama Canal, and I'll get congressional approval later. So he signs these treaties without Senate approval. He puts money towards this thing without House approval, and he's just moving forward with this thing. Not a lot of respect for the Constitution among the progressives, which we'll talk about when we get to that. Okay, he eventually gets support for it because it's just everybody wants the Panama Canal. Okay, so it ends up getting built. It takes another 10 years, but America is able to build the Panama Canal, and now we've achieved everything that Mahan said. Dominate the Caribbean, canal across Central America, powerful Navy, control of Hawaii and Samoa. All right. While Roosevelt is president, Venezuela gets itself into a crisis. They had gotten into heavy debt to Britain, and they were negging on the debt. Britain is using that as an excuse to go into Venezuela and take it over in order to get it to pay its debt. Venezuela appeals to the United States saying this is a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. So we say to Britain, hey, what are you doing? You can't go into Venezuela like that. And the British say, all right, we'll acknowledge that America has influence here. We'll acknowledge the Monroe Doctrine, but that's got to cut both ways. If you're the big brother of Latin America, if you're going to protect Latin America, you also have to make sure that Latin America conducts its affairs properly and pays its debts and doesn't just do whatever it wants because it's got the United States on its side. So Roosevelt issues the Roosevelt Corollary, which is addition to the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine says Europe has to stay out of Latin America. The Roosevelt Corollary says, this is important, the United States has the right to intervene in the affairs of Latin America when it sees fit. In other words, he's saying the United States is essentially the policeman of Latin America. We'll protect Latin America, but we're going to enforce the rules on Latin America as well. And that's where this famous cartoon of Roosevelt as a policeman comes from, where he's got the big stick, which is his policy. This has been largely repudiated. Again, Hoover's renunciation of the Roosevelt Corollary and his removal of the Platt Amendment from the Cuban Constitution was a direct answer to thinking the Roosevelt Corollary was unfair. It does a lot of damage in Latin America because successive presidents are going to constantly invade Latin America as they see fit to enforce good behavior by our standards. And as you might imagine, Latin America doesn't really like that too much. So this idea that we're going to enforce rules in Latin America as well as protect them is the change he brings to the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, that's where we're going to end today. We'll start with William Howard Taft on Thursday. Like I said, Wednesday I'll finish up the different things I touched on here in terms of the Philippine insurrection and our conduct in China with the Boxer Rebellion and the spheres of influence. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Hope you guys understand this, and I'll see you on Wednesday.